Shalom and welcome to the fifth lesson in our study, Kings and Prophets. God searches for a heart fully His. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for notifications when new videos are posted. And while you're over there, check out the other studies that are available. We actually have over 115 videos right now, so go check them out. If you'd like to join us for our live study, you can contact me through Facebook Messenger and I'll send you a link and password for our free Zoom classes held every Thursday from 6:30 to 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now below this video is a link to the student pages for tonight's study. So I hope you'll either print it out or save it as a reference not only for this study, but you never know when you may need it on down the line. Now, next week, we're actually going to begin our study of Elisha, passing the mantle, experiencing the unchanging power of God in our changing times. Now, there is so much to unpack in today's lesson that we're going to forego any kind of a review and jump right into our lesson in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Now, in the first 4 verses, we see that Jehoshaphat and Judah are looking at a war. But a combined war with Ammon and Moab. They got together and now they're about to go to war with the southern kingdom, with Jerusalem. Now, Jehoshaphat, of course, he's human. He got really afraid. But in his fear, he turned his attention toward God. Now that attention is panim. It literally means the face or his presence. So he turned his face to look for the presence of God. And this time he went to seek. This is a different seek from last week. This seek is a pakash, and it means to seek because you're looking for something. You want to find security. You want to find something. You want to be able to request something. You want to look at someone's face. You want to seek the face, seek their attention. But he didn't try to actually take this on alone. He called everybody in the southern kingdom, from Judah, from Jerusalem, to seek God, to fast, and also to pray. Now, moving on down in verses 5 through 12, Jehoshaphat went to the temple to pray. And everything Jehoshaphat prayed for was very, very specific and relevant to the situation he was facing. He didn't need Raphael, the God, the healer. He needed Adonai Tsabaoth. He needed the God of angel armies. But he also didn't start with this big, long wish list. God wasn't a genie in his mind that he could just rub the lamp and poof, and just make all these requests and God would just hand it to him. So instead he started by praising God. And he acknowledged God's attributes that were very specific again to what he needed. He praised God for his power and for his might. For his gabulah, its bravery and valor and splendor. And very specifically, it denotes the mighty deeds of God. He acknowledges, he confesses that God is the ruler of all the nations, including Moab and Ammon, who are actually the ones coming after him. He reminds God, not that God needed reminding, but he told God, you gave us this land. We're your people. You put your name and your reputation in the temple that you chose to put in Jerusalem. And then he goes all the way back to the beginning, goes all the way back to Abraham and starts relating all the covenants that he gave them. And if you look in chapter 20, verse 7, he says that Abraham, your friend forever. It's a ahav. It means it's one that's really, really intimately known. Now, Abraham was the only human being ever referred to by God using the term ahav. And if you want a cross-reference for that, it's Exodus chapter 33, verse 11. Now, God does call other people his friend, but it's more of like an acquaintance, someone that you know, but you're not really intimately known by them, and they don't intimately know you. So while he called other people friends, Abraham was the only one he used ahav, that intimacy. He also acknowledged that in their distress, that God was still going to be able to deliver them. So in their trouble, in their stress, in their fear, that God was going to yasha. He was going to save them. He was going to deliver them, to liberate them, and to make them victorious. The most honest and powerful part of Jehoshaphat's prayer is in verse 12, where it says, "O our God, will you not judge them? For we are powerless before this great multitude who are coming against us, nor do we know what to do, but our eyes are on you." God, you need to be the judge. You need to decide what's going to happen to these people who are coming against us, because we have no idea. We're powerless. We understand that. I confess that. I acknowledge that. I don't have any idea what to do. I don't know how to lead them. We don't know how to fight them. But even in our fear, even in our uncertainty, even in our powerlessness, God, we are going to keep our eyes on you. Powerless, ein, we are nothing. There is nothing that we can do because we are nothing. We lack. It means to be without. You know, there's a kind of a Hebrewism, I guess, that says we don't seek God's hand. We seek God's face. We don't seek God just for what he can do for us, what he can give us, what he can grant us, what he can give to us. We seek God's face. We seek his will. We keep our eyes focused on God and what he wants us to do, even when what he wants us to do is absolutely nothing. Because look at what happens in verses 13 through 17 of 2 Chronicles chapter 20. The Spirit of God speaks through a Levite, Jahaziel, and he tells him, "Do not fear, because the battle is mine." And then he tells the people of Judah and Jerusalem, you need to gather yourselves up and you need to go station yourselves. But they are not stationing themselves for battle. He's not taking his 1,160,000 soldiers out to the field, fully armed in their battle armament, with their shields, with their swords, with their spears, with their bows and arrows, to go out and to meet Ammon and Moab in battle. That's not what they're doing. They're going out, they're gathering themselves, they're stationing themselves in the place of battle to be spectators and to stand there and to watch what God's going to go do for them. And then in verse 17, it tells us exactly what they're expecting by faith for God to do. In verse 17, it says, "You need not fight in this battle. Station yourselves, stand and see the salvation of the Lord on your behalf, Judah and Jerusalem. Do not fear. Tomorrow go out and face them, for the Lord is with you." They are fully expecting their salvation, their Yeshua, their deliverance, their welfare, their prosperity, and their victory. And they know it's going to come, and it's not going to have anything to do with them. It's going to have everything to do with God. And so here's our application. Does God always fight our battles without us ever having to fight? Does God always fight our battles without us ever having to fight? My answer to that is no. I think of Gideon. I think of David. I think of Joshua. And when I think of Gideon and David and Joshua, one of the things that really strikes me is that what God tells them to do, or the way God tells them to quote unquote fight, doesn't make any military sense at all. So it's not that they're not going to participate, but they're not going to do what they expect to do. Why? So that God can show himself to be their victory. God himself can show himself to be their Yasha, to be their Yeshua, their deliverance, their welfare, and their victory. So if that's the case, then what does it mean when God says in Scripture that the battle belongs to the Lord? What exactly does that mean then? That if God tells us things that we need to do, even when they don't make any sense, then how then does that battle belong to the Lord? The battle belongs to the Lord because the fight belongs to the Lord, because the victory in that battle belongs to the Lord. And it doesn't have to be against these big, huge armies like Ammon and Moab, who also got together with the people of Mount Seir, which were Edom. It's not always about us going against, I doubt very seriously any of us have ever gone to battle against 3 different countries before. We could never face that by ourselves. That would be insane. But you know what? We have daily battles that we have to get through every day. And in those battles every day, God will tell us. Sometimes he says, yeah, like David, sometimes he says you need to pick up no armor, just go pick up some rocks and go sling them at your giant because I'll make the giant fall. Sometimes he's like Gideon and he says, you know what? You go with your pot and you put your candle in your pot and you break it and you blow the horns and you say for the Lord and for Gideon, and I'll make everything so scramble with the enemies that are trying to come up against you that they'll just destroy themselves. And sometimes, though, he does just what he told to Judah and Jerusalem, and he tells you, you know what? Just stand there. Just stand there and don't do anything. And watch what I'm going to do for you. How easy is it to be a spectator? It's really hard. It's really hard to turn a big ship around to avoid the storm, but it's even harder to hold that ship still when you're in the middle of one. So let's look at what the people of Judah and Jerusalem did, starting down in verse 18. They worshiped God. They praised him. Worship is not really an act. It's more of you doing nothing. It's shachah. It's when you prostrate yourself and you bow to the ground, that your face is on the ground and you are down in a very humbling position in front of God. And you know why it's important to worship and to bow down and to be still, because it's really hard to run when you're on your knees, and it's hard to run when you're laying on your face. You can't run. And that word for praise, hallel, it's not really what we do. And what we think of as praise, like we're singing, we're praising God, and we are singing, yes, but are you praising God? Because praising is not just we praise you, God, we praise you, God. It literally means to boast or to shine. And figuratively, it means to make a spotlight on God's favor. So in our worship, are we humbled before God? Are we prostrate? Are we bowing before the God of the universe? And are we truly praising, which is simply to boast about God and to praise him, to boast back to him exactly what he's already done? Now, one interesting thing about Jerusalem and Judah is that this all this praise and worship and being laid out before God, this is actually before the battle ever started. They were praising God because God answered them, because God said, I'm going to win this for you, even though the answer from God and how he was going to win is absolutely nuts, because they're sitting with a 1.16 million man army that's going to stand and watch. By the time we get down to verse 20, this is the battle day. This is the day of battle. And instead of gathering for war, they gather to watch a show. They gather to see what God's going to do. And then look at what Jehoshaphat tells the people of Judah to do in verse 20. He tells them to do two things. First thing he tells them to do is to put their trust in God, because if you put your trust in God, you will be established. Trust, aman, to be faithful. If you are faithful to God, he will establish you. That word establish is the exact same word, aman. So if you are faithful to God, if you support what God is doing, if you confirm that God is God, then guess what? God is going to support, to confirm, and to be faithful to you. When God turns his back on people, he never turns his back first. And he never turns it after the first mistake. The second thing he tells them to do is put your trust in God's prophets, in his word, and you'll succeed. Succeed is also a great word because it's the word tzalak, which means to prosper and to progress and to advance. It's not the end game. If I do this and this and this and this and this, then eventually down the road at the end, that's where I'm going to meet success. That's not what it means. Tzalak is the journey moving forward. So just because you flunk it at this step, you keep moving forward, you keep trusting God's word, then that's progress. You're prospering, you're advancing, you're succeeding. Success is one faithful step after the other. And so, what did Judah do then? They started the worship service all over, thanking God for his loving kindness, for his chesed, for his goodness, for his faithfulness, for his mercy. And when the praises started to go up, God's judgment came down on their enemies. He set an ambush and a rub. It means to lie in wait, but it wasn't the people lying in wait. It was God. And God said, while I'm doing this ambush, they are going to be routed. They're going to be stricken. They're going to be smitten, and they're going to stumble. And that's exactly what they did, because first, Ammon and Moab totally turned and destroyed the people of Mount Seir. They totally destroyed the army of Edom. Look at 1 Kings real quick. Flip to 1 Kings, chapter 22, which was part of what we read in preparing for our lesson tonight. Verse 47. 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 47, and it says, "Now there was no king in Edom. A deputy was king." Why was there no king in Edom? Because Edom was on the battlefield, and Ammon and Moab wiped them out. And then for some really weird reason, as if that wasn't strange enough for these people from Judah and Jerusalem watching this happen right in front of them, Ammon and Moab then turned on each other and they destroyed each other. And absolutely not one person escaped. This was total annihilation of three of the most powerful nations to ever come up against the southern kingdom. They came up against them together and they totally annihilated one another. And then in verse 24 through 30, we see the result of Jehoshaphat, the righteous king, not only seeking God, but the people being obedient. They got the spoil from the battle 3 days. 3 days they went out and gathered spoil. That's a lot of spoil. They got blessings from God. They got joy, simcha, gladness, pleasure, good results. They began to praise. The Lord sent a dread on all their enemies, sent a terror. So while the southern kingdom is enjoying the spoils and the blessings and the joy, the dread of the Lord was on their enemy. And then while their enemies have the dread of God, it tells us that the southern kingdom enjoyed peace and they enjoyed rest on all sides. Nobody would come up against them. And then in verse 31 through 37, we see another attempt of an alliance was made with the king of Israel. This time not by a marriage. This time they were just kind of in league with one another. But as a result of this alliance, God actually sent the prophet Eleazar to tell Jehoshaphat that what he was doing was really just, it was a bad idea, and he just shouldn't have done it. And he said, because of that, God's going to destroy your ships that you're about to send out. And going back to 1 Kings 22, verse 48, it says, Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they didn't go, for the ships were broken at Ezion-Geber. Then Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, let my servants go with you in the ships. But Jehoshaphat was not willing. So after these ships were built, the new ships, the first ones were destroyed because he made this alliance, because Jehoshaphat made another unrighteous alliance with the northern kingdom. So when they got rebuilt, Ahaziah asked him again if he could be part of the trip from Tarshish to Ophir to gather up the gold. But Jehoshaphat learned his lesson, and he said, absolutely no way. So then comes the question, was Jehoshaphat actually a man whose heart was fully devoted to God? I would say yeah. Jehoshaphat's like the rest of us. He's totally a human being. He wasn't perfect. He made some really bad, dumb choices in his life. And, he had some hard lessons he had to learn. But he was always real quick to course correct. And he consistently and constantly sought God. And then in 2 Chronicles 21, verse 1, it says, Jehoshaphat slept, which is actually a very interesting concept. And that word slept is shakab, and it means to lay down. Now, we know it means he died, because it says he slept and he was buried. He died. We know that. But it says he slept. He laid down. So just kind of keep that in mind, because we're gonna look at how someone else ended up dying. Now, in 2 Kings chapter 1, we're starting 2 Kings. In 2 Kings chapter 1, we're kind of getting to this time frame. Between 1 Kings 22, the very last chapter of 1 Kings, is about 870 BC. Then when we turn to 2 Kings chapter 1, we've now jumped 17 years. So we are now 17 years after 1 Kings 22. This was about a year before Elijah was taken into heaven. Elijah was taken in 852. Ahab died in 853. This was about 4 years before Jehoshaphat slept in 848. And it's the exact same year that Jehoram became king. There was a little bit of an overlap with Jehoshaphat. So now the king of the northern kingdom, we have Ahaziah, who was Ahab's son, Ahab and Jezebel's son, and he actually was only king for 2 years. Now, it says that Moab rebelled against Israel again. And then in verse 2, for some reason, somehow, I don't know if he flipped out or whatever, but now Moab is going after the northern kingdom, and Ahaziah falls. And when he fell, he must have been hurt pretty darn bad, because he wanted to know if he was going to die or not. So then he decided he was going to seek his answers from Baal-zebub instead of God. Now, Baal-zebub, we tend to think of as Satan, but it literally means the Lord of the Fly, and it's a deity that was worshipped by the Philistines in Ekron. So now God sent Elijah to ask Ahaziah if there was no God in Israel. Why would God want to know if, according to Ahaziah, if God was in Israel? Israel was God's land, and the people that were in Israel, the northern kingdom, were God's people. And if you remember in the Hebrew Near Eastern mindset, gods were landlocked. So Ahaziah actually went outside of Israel to inquire of a god of another land instead of the God who was already in the land. So why wouldn't he just ask God? Because God really wasn't the God of Israel. They had been involved in Baal worship ever since the time of Jeroboam, ever since the split. So the king sent messengers to Elijah to see what his answer would be. And Elijah said, yeah, he's going to die. Well, that wasn't good enough for Ahaziah. He wanted Elijah not to tell his messengers. He wanted Elijah to come to him in Samaria and explain what was going to happen and then tell him to his face whether he was going to live or die. So he sent a captain and 50 men after Elijah. And look what Elijah said. He said, if I am a man of God, let fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men. And fire came down from heaven and consumed them all. So instead of taking that as a sign that Elijah's not coming and Ahaziah needs to get his affairs in order because he's really going to die, Ahaziah decides to send another 51 men, a captain and 50 men, over to Elijah and tell him, you need to come on. King wants you. Get up. Let's go. How do you think those 50 men kind of felt? They had to have known what happened. Otherwise, why would they need to go? I mean, they're only going after one man. 50 people ought to be able to handle and get one old prophet back over to the king. So they had to have known that these guys were like consumed from heavenly fire, and they had to go. It was their orders. So they went. They said, man of God, the king says, gotta come. And Elijah says, you know what? If I'm a man of God, fire's going to come down and consume you. And guess what happened? Fire came down and consumed them. Ahaziah finds out about it, sends another 51 men after Elijah. Now this guy, this captain was smart. He had to be thinking, you know what? I'm not going to do what they did. We're going to try a different approach about all this. I'm not just going to go and demand that this man of God come see the king. So he actually approached him very humbly. And he said, man of God, please let my life and the lives of these 50 servants of yours be precious, be yakar, be valuable in your sight. I know fire came down from heaven and consumed the first two of the 50 with their 50s, but now please let my life be precious in your sight. And so an angel of God told Elijah, go ahead and go. So he gets there to Ahaziah, and guess what? His message didn't change. He says, you're going to die. Now, die is not the same as slept. Slept, remember, means to lay down. We know he died. Different mindset. He laid down. Die is moot, and it does mean to die, but it also means to die prematurely by neglect of wise moral conduct. And in verse 17, it doesn't say Ahaziah slept. It said Ahaziah died. Why did he die? Why did he die prematurely by neglect of wise moral conduct? Because he refused to acknowledge that God is still God in Israel. Now, you all know by now my mind thinks in just certain ways. And when I read that, it got me thinking, what does this say about our current state of our country? Is God still the God of the United States? Do we really put our trust in God as is minted on every bit of our money? Is God the God of your city, of your neighborhood, of your family, of you? Or are you going outside to some other God in the world to find your answers? What have you set up as an idol? Because when you really think about it, God is not your God. God is not the God in your life. Now, when Ahaziah died, he didn't have any sons. He didn't have any children. As far as we know, he wasn't even married. So his brother Jehoram actually became king. So to keep things very, very interesting and very, very confusing, there are now two different King Jehorams. I know. They need a little more creativity. We have Jehoram of the north and Jehoram of the south. And to make it even more confusing, they're actually united by a marriage alliance. Jehoram of Judah, Jehoram of the south, married Athaliah, who was Jehoram's of the north's sister. She was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. So now these two Jehorams, north and south, are actually brother-in-laws or brothers-in-law. So now flip on over to 2 Kings 2. This will be our last chapter we go through. Now in 1 Kings 19, verses 16 through 21, we see Elijah going with Elijah from Gilgal to Bethel to Jericho to the Jordan River, and everywhere they stopped. What did the sons of the prophets have to say to Elisha? Don't you know that God's going to take your master today? And that master, Adon, we use it to mean God. Master, Adonai, our master, our God. And it means someone who's firm or strong, or the Lord, little L, Lord. So Elisha's response was, I know this. Just be still. Just be quiet. Chasha, be silent. So Elisha followed Elijah around for a number of years, probably about 7 years. And he saw what it would take to actually fulfill the ministry of being Israel's prophet. Israel was a messed up, godless place to be a prophet. So then he asked Elijah for a double portion of his spirit, his ruach, his mind. It's your breath, your wind, your spirit, and that double portion is just your mouth. So don't breathe on me once, breathe on me twice. But Elijah didn't just say, okay, I'll go ahead and give it to you. He said, Elisha, the only way you're actually going to get a double portion is if you see me go up into heaven in a whirlwind. Now, let me ask you this. Do you get the impression that this was why Elisha kept following Elijah around? I mean, his answer to Elijah, every time Elijah told him to stay put, that God called him somewhere else, Elisha used very strong covenant language. So why would Elisha feel the need to have this double portion? Was he being greedy? Or do you think it's because he knew his limitations? And so he felt he needed really some extra to make it and to be effective, because he was feeling really inadequate and not quite up for the job. Now that day, Elijah was taken up. He didn't sleep and he didn't die. He was actually taken in a whirlwind. And so Elisha did get a double portion because he did witness Elijah going up in a whirlwind. But what fell, as Elijah was going up, what fell was Elijah's mantle, his adalet, his glory, his splendor, his magnificence. It's the prophet's garment. And so what did Elijah ask? He said, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And he took that mantle and he struck the Jordan River, and the waters parted, and he walked across on dry land, exactly what Elijah had done. Elijah's last miracle on earth was Elisha's very first miracle. And this allowed everyone around him to know, to verify that Elisha did indeed have Elijah's spirit within him, and he was going to be a prophet of Israel. Now, that wasn't actually his only miracle that he performed that day. He also purified water. He dumped in salt, which should make it bitter and make it a lot worse, but it didn't. It purified it. It healed it. And then the very last kind of miracle, if you want to call it that, mentioned in this chapter, lions ate some kids, some people, some lads, is what my Bible says. Now, lads it could be young boys. They're older than like children, teenagers maybe, young adults, but it could also be the word for servant. And that young katan does mean young, but not like little babies, but it could also mean unimportant and insignificant. And so Elisha cursed him. Kalal means to treat them with contempt or to bring dishonor, to treat them like they're of very little account. And 42 of them were eaten by mama lions that very day. So after this really crazy day, what did Elisha do? He went back home to Samaria and he went to work. Now, when we looked at Elijah, there were some cross references. Our first one we looked at was in Malachi. And Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6 says that God's going to send Elijah again before the day of the Lord, that he's going to restore the hearts of Israel at that time. But what was Elijah's purpose the first round on earth? It was to turn the hearts toward God. But most of Israel didn't. Nearly no one in Israel turned their hearts back to God. Now, in Matthew 16:28 through 17:13, this is when Jesus was on the Mount of Transfiguration, and Moses and Elijah appeared with him. Now, Moses represented the law, Elijah represented the prophets, and Jesus represented the fulfillment of them both, of the law and also the prophets. Now, Jesus to his disciples reiterated that Elijah was coming and was going to restore all things. But he also says, he's already come, because who came in the spirit of Elijah? John the Baptizer. So if Israel as a whole nation, would have believed John and repented, then he actually would have fulfilled completely Malachi 4, 5 through 6. But the problem is Malachi 4 is meant for more than just first century Jerusalem. So there's actually going to be a time in the future when Elijah does come back and he does restore the hearts of Israel before Messiah's second advent. I truly believe that that event is described in Revelation chapter 11. I believe he's one of the witnesses that are mentioned. And I believe the other one happens to be Enoch, because that's the only other person in the Bible that never died. And Scripture does say that men are meant to die once, and then after that, judgment. So I do have one correction. Those boys, servants, they were eaten by bears, not by lions. So thank you for joining me for this study of Kings and Prophets. God searches for a heart fully His. I pray that through this study, you've learned some really valuable truths that you can apply to your own life, not only as an encouragement, but as a plumb line for some self-examination. If you're going to be joining us for our next study, which is about Elijah, kings and prophets, passing the mantle, and you don't have a book, you can actually prepare by studying 2 Kings chapters 2 through 4. So until next time, Shavua Tov, have a great, great week. Shalom, shalom.